Have you ever experienced that strange sensation when you return to a place that once defined your entire existence, only to discover you've transformed into something invisible? The coffee no longer carries the same richness. The mechanical whir emanating from the data center sounds less like achievement and more like a ticking clock measuring something ominous. For 17 years, this enterprise represented everything I had poured myself into. I wasn't merely someone collecting a paycheck. My name was permanently inscribed on the founding documentation of this $350 million establishment, the very foundation itself. But a newly appointed head of human resources viewed that name as nothing more than an expendable entry waiting to be erased. He assumed it carried zero significance. He was about to receive an extraordinarily costly lesson in contractual obligations. So if you're watching this right now, perhaps during your commute, perhaps while taking a break from work, just answer me this one thing. What location are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments section. I'm curious to see how widely this narrative reaches. And if something within you connects with something in this, I hope you'll stay. My name is Paisley Mercer, and for the past 17 years I have served as the Director of Technological Innovation at a company I helped construct from a solitary concept scribbled on a cocktail napkin. That concept centered on developing cybersecurity solutions that weren't simply lucrative but genuinely protective of individual privacy and digital freedom. During those initial days, we operated as a compact team powered by marathon work sessions, takeout containers, and the conviction that we were building something meaningful. We weren't just coworkers. We were devoted followers of a unified purpose, and our contributions demonstrated that dedication. That collective commitment was the force that expanded our modest startup into a dominant force in the digital security industry. Then the acquisition occurred. A massive conglomerate purchased us, and while they preserved the branding, they systematically replaced the company's essence with balance sheets and profit margins. The new chief operating officer, a woman named Eleanor whom I'd only encountered in polished promotional materials, communicated in an entirely different vocabulary. It was a dialect of metrics, of maximizing operational productivity, of investor returns above everything else. Our purpose to innovate for protection was repackaged into generating proprietary technology that could generate revenue streams. The dedication had vanished, substituted by an unyielding fixation on fiscal quarter performance reviews. My position, previously fundamental to the organization's trajectory, started to feel decorative. I had become the phantom within the architecture. My presence at executive strategy sessions became suggested rather than required. My comprehensive analyses on extended development initiatives were acknowledged with automated electronic responses. And my allocation for new experimental technology was suspended without explanation. I was being eliminated gradually, systematically, not through an overt declaration of hostility, but through the quiet advancing disregard of countless minor dismissals. The individual coordinating this gradual erasure was Connor Hayes, the newly installed head of human resources. He was someone who perceived employees not as valuable resources but as potential problems requiring management. One Wednesday afternoon I was returning from the beverage area, weaving through the recognizable labyrinth of workstations. As I walked past the primary meeting space with its floor-to-ceiling transparent walls, I observed Eleanor, the chief operating officer, positioned inside with Connor. They were examining a massive display showing a revised corporate hierarchy. My attention instantly located the segment marked in a harsh, unforgiving crimson. It was my complete division, my collection of exceptional technologists. I paused for merely a moment, somewhat concealed by an enormous decorative plant that the recent management had positioned for workplace atmosphere. I observed as Connor addressed Eleanor, his demeanor assured and contemptuous. He motioned toward that crimson segment on the display, the container that held my life's dedication. And although the glass was substantial, I was positioned close enough to observe his mouth shape the words with absolute precision. Her complete division is a relic, he stated. Her name is merely a historical formality. It carries zero worth at this point. A coldness moved through me, but it wasn't rooted in grief or apprehension. It was the frigid, penetrating lucidity of an ultimate reality exposed. They didn't simply view me as antiquated. They perceived the very infrastructure I had constructed as meaningless. They had neglected to remember that a historical formality inscribed onto the appropriate documentation carries the greatest significance of all. I didn't show any reaction. I didn't allow the surprise to manifest on my features. I simply continued back to my workspace, the subdued mechanical sound of the servers that I had assisted in implementing suddenly resonating less like advancement and more like a countdown mechanism. The remainder of that day transpired in an unusual elevated consciousness. The countdown I sensed wasn't one of alarm, but of calculated expectation. I didn't allocate my time lamenting my status. I allocated it documenting 17 years of my development documentation, distinguishing my individual intellectual contributions from organizational property. I was merely preparing for an exit I understood was approaching long before I witnessed it articulated by Connor's expression. The official notification materialized following the afternoon break. Its subject heading a work of art in corporate circumlocution. A session to examine revised structural arrangements. Connor's workspace was an antiseptic glass enclosure on the executive level with a sweeping perspective of the metropolis I could no longer perceive as mine. Everything within was fastidiously positioned, from the matching writing instruments on his workstation to the conceptual artwork on the partition intended to communicate authority. There were 0 individual elements, nothing to indicate the space belonged to a human being rather than an organizational purpose. He acknowledged me with an expression that was entirely dental and 0 genuine feeling, indicating for me to occupy a seat deliberately positioned lower than his personal one. He didn't squander moments with courteous conversation. He pushed a glossy printout of the revised structural hierarchy across the refined surface of his workstation. It was the identical one I had witnessed on the display, an arrangement of precise connections and containers that had carefully eliminated my complete team. Paisley, he initiated his tone practiced and polished. As you're aware, the organization is advancing towards a more efficient, coordinated functional structure. As component of this transformation, we've reached the challenging determination to disband the primary technological innovation division. He stopped, presumably for dramatic impact. Nevertheless, the Chief Operating Officer and I acknowledge your extended tenure with the organization. That's the reason we've established a specialized advisory position for you. It will permit you to keep offering your knowledge on an assignment foundation. He reclined, the image of organizational generosity. But the proposition was a significant insult camouflaged as consideration. A designation with 0 team, a status with 0 authority, and I possessed 0 uncertainty. A compensation that demonstrated their recent reduced assessment of my value. I allowed the quietness to suspend in the atmosphere for a period, observing the assurance in his gaze. He anticipated appreciation. He anticipated discussion, potentially even emotional response. I provided him absolutely nothing of it. I simply encountered his stare and stated with a subdued conclusiveness, "Negative appreciation, Connor. That won't be required." For the initial moment, his practiced facade fractured. Just for an instant, a glimpse of authentic incredulity, swiftly pursued by frustration, traversed his features. He had presented the exiting monarch a position as a subordinate in the revised administration, and she had declined the offering. He recuperated rapidly, his expression returning with a pointed, dismissive boundary. "As you prefer," he stated, his inflection making it transparent the proposition was withdrawn. "Your entry permissions will be terminated by 5 o'clock. Protection will accompany you from the facility." He anticipated me to dispute. He anticipated me to beg. Rather, I simply acknowledged, rose and proceeded towards the exit. He didn't understand that my most critical permission, the one that genuinely provided entry to the organization's worth, was never housed on their computer systems. It was housed in a flame-resistant container in my residential workspace on a document displaying my inscription. The departure from the structure was disorienting. The protection officer, who had consistently acknowledged me with a cordial expression, couldn't encounter my gaze as he accompanied me to the principal entrance. He maintained the entrance open, and as I advanced into the late afternoon atmosphere, I experienced the conclusiveness of the instant settle over me. 17 years of my existence, a profession I had constructed from nothing, had just been terminated by an impersonal organizational directive. The journey to my residence was soundless. I didn't experience fury or grief. What I experienced was a significant quietness, the variety that arrives after a tempest has concluded. My residential workspace was the absolute contrary of Connor's antiseptic chamber. It was a space saturated with chronology. Storage units overflowed with technology publications. Aged prototypes occupied display positions like treasured artifacts, and faded images of my initial team were attached to a bulletin surface. I initiated the gradual, systematic procedure of organizing, examining through the recollections each object symbolized. A narrative they were resolved to disregard. While eliminating items from my storage cabinet, I located it. Not through fortune, I understood precisely its location. It was a substantial leather-encased container designated for documentation of tremendous significance. The golden inscription on the exterior was straightforward. Formation and founding documentation. My digits outlined the words before I accessed it. The document within was substantial, displaying the initial inscriptions of myself and the additional co-founders. My gaze examined past the conventional provisions, arriving on a segment near the conclusion. Section 7C. It possessed a designation I had demanded years prior, the Creator's Safeguard Provision. I hadn't examined it in over a dozen years, but I recalled its essence flawlessly. It was a protection mechanism, a defense for the originators against the commercial individuals who might eventually disregard how the commercial entity was originated. It specified in transparent terminology that should any founding signatory be dismissed without legitimate justification and through non-consensual means, their individual allocation of proprietary technology rights to the organization could be at their exclusive judgment withdrawn with 30 calendar days written notification. Essentially, they couldn't dismiss the founder and preserve the founder's innovations without authorization. A gradual respiration departed my respiratory system. This wasn't a technical loophole. It was an entrance I had constructed into the very infrastructure of the organization. A mechanism I had preserved for a crisis I never anticipated would materialize. They had not simply dismissed me. They had executed so with contemptuous arrogance, eliminating my division and presenting an offensive reduced position. It was the precise characterization of being dismissed without legitimate justification. They had violated the solitary provision that maintained everything unified. I secured the container gradually, the gentle impact resonating in the silent space. I retrieved my communication device, my appendage flawlessly stable, and located the contact for my attorney. He was a longtime associate, someone who had existed from the initiation. He responded on the subsequent signal. "Paisley, I recently learned," he stated, his tone saturated with worry. "I'm deeply sympathetic." "Don't be, Andrew," I responded. "I possess an inquiry. Do you recall the Creator's Safeguard Provision we positioned into the initial authorization documentation?" There was an extended pause on the alternative portion of the connection, then a gradual exclamation. "Dear heavens, Paisley," he stated. "They didn't." "Andrew," I stated, my tone flawlessly controlled. "I comprehend they've just committed a $350 million error." Andrew's guidance was straightforward and transparent. There would be zero emotional exchanges, zero irate telephone communications, zero casual electronic messages that could be disregarded. The subsequent action had to be an official, legally enforceable notification. We allocated the subsequent day constructing the correspondence, a work of art of frigid exactness, removed of all sentiment, departing only the rigid realities of the agreement. We referenced Section 7C, the Creator's Safeguard Provision, and articulated my legal standing. The correspondence informed the administration I was implementing my entitlement to withdraw the authorization for the organization's fundamental proprietary technology, providing them a 30-day correction interval. Following that, the infrastructure of their complete function would be legally extracted. The subsequent morning, I traveled to the principal postal facility. I didn't simply deposit the correspondence in a collection receptacle. I positioned myself in queue and compensated for verified postal service with a receipt confirmation demanded. In an era of transient digital communications, I was establishing a tangible documentation trail that could be validated in judicial proceedings. The postal employee stamped the containers with a substantial, gratifying impact. It experienced less like transmitting a correspondence and more like establishing a chronometer on an explosive device. 10 identical containers were transmitted to the Chief Operating Officer and each of the 9 administration members at their personal residences. There would be zero believable rejection. The days that pursued were saturated with a significant quietness. I had anticipated frantic communications from their legal division, potentially even a threatening correspondence, but there was nothing. The absence of acknowledgement was an authority maneuver, a calculated determination to process my notification as inconsequential. They assumed by disregarding me they could render me insignificant. They didn't comprehend the agreement didn't necessitate their involvement, only their notification. The 30-day chronometer was progressing whether they selected to observe it or not. I didn't examine my communication device compulsively. I initiated cultivating in my garden space, permitting the procedure to progress as it was constructed to. The quietness was ultimately interrupted a week subsequent by a communication from Leonard, one of the initial administration members, a respectable individual confined in the revised organizational atmosphere. His tone was tense, saturated with an alarm he was attempting to hide. "Paisley, what in the universe have you executed? There's a correspondence. I notified the administration of a pre-existing contractual responsibility." "Leonard, that's all." I responded calmly. He released a brief, exasperated sound. "Notified them, Paisley, they aren't processing it genuinely." Eleanor, the chief operating officer, expressed amusement about it in an executive personnel session. She characterized it as a deception. He paused and his tone descended lower. "And Connor from Human Resources, he performed a demonstration of it. He positioned your verified correspondence through his workspace destruction device in view of 3 additional administrators. I appreciated him for the data and terminated the telephone communication, a frigid stillness establishing over me. The arrogance was astounding. The destruction device was a performative, ridiculous action. But in their endeavor to exhibit authority, they had just committed a critical error. They had supplied me with something invaluable, a witness to their personal intentional carelessness. When I informed Andrew about the destroyed correspondence, his acknowledgement was instantaneous. "Intentional carelessness," he stated, his tone calm but penetrating. He verified they had advanced beyond straightforward arrogance into dynamic recklessness. He clarified that by destroying an official legal notification in view of witnesses, they could no longer assert ignorance or straightforward error. They had been informed of a fundamental risk and had deliberately dismissed it, a reality that would be indefensible in any legal environment. His guidance was unchanged. Execute nothing. Preserve. The 30-day chronometer was still progressing. 2 additional weeks transpired. From the exterior nothing had transformed. The organization's equity value was consistent, and their announcements were favorable. To any observer, it would appear their approach of disregarding me had succeeded. I persisted to maintain my garden space, discovering a particular contradiction in the reality that while I was nurturing new existence, the foundations of the organization I had constructed were initiating to deteriorate from a toxin of their personal manufacturing. The initial tremor arrived not from an internal communication, but from across the ocean. Leonard communicated with me again, his tone now removed of all formality, substituted by raw alarm. "It's the Japanese arrangement, Paisley," he stated, omitting any acknowledgement. "The Tokyo expansion agreement, it's suspended." He clarified that their fastidious Japanese collaborators were renewing a $75 million agreement and as component of standard verification had demanded a currently implemented duplicate of the organization's authorization for the fundamental technology. Naturally, the only documentation my previous organization could supply was the initial agreement displaying my inscription. The Japanese collective inquired for a revised supplement validating the proprietary technology was protected following the exit of a founding authorizer. My organization possessed nothing to demonstrate to them. Confronted with an ambiguous sequence of possession, the Japanese had instantly positioned the complete $75 million arrangement on indefinite suspension. For an organization like theirs, an agreement is a holy document and the sequence of possession an indestructible connection. Any uncertainty was not an issue to be addressed subsequently. It was a foundational deficiency that suspended everything instantly. Leonard informed me the chief operating officer was infuriated, attributing her legal division for the negligence. Connor, the head of Human Resources, was reportedly attempting to characterize it as a trivial administrative complication, guaranteeing everyone it would be resolved. They were initiating to comprehend this wasn't a matter that could be addressed with a dismissal document. They were initiating to perceive the phantom they assumed they had exorcised. While that combustion was initiating to ignite in their administrative space, I received a subdued, automated electronic message from the United States Patent and Authorization Administration. I accessed it calmly. It was an official notification. An submission filed by my previous organization just 4 days preceding to modify the principal patent authorization had been examined and declined. The justification for the declination was documented in frigid, straightforward text. Inability to obtain the inscription of all initial documented authorizers. They had attempted to eliminate me from a document in a workspace session. Now they had attempted to eliminate my designation from a governmental record, and they were discovering that some inscriptions don't diminish. I transmitted the official declination notification from the Patent Administration to Andrew with a solitary statement. For your documentation, his acknowledgement arrived minutes subsequent. They are officially constructing our argument for us, he documented. Every maneuver they execute demonstrates a transparent pattern of inadequacy and dishonest intention. We both understood their unsuccessful endeavor to modify a governmental documentation was more than just another mistake. It was a frantic action that would appear terrible in any procedure. My approach of subdued, patient force was functioning. The organization, through its personal alarmed actions, was constricting the restraint around its personal anatomy. It was only a duration of time before the internal issue became a public one. The information about the suspended Japanese arrangement ultimately escaped. A modest publication appeared in a regarded financial publication authored by a journalist recognized for comprehensive industry associations. It didn't reference my designation, but it didn't have to. It articulated of a substantial Asian agreement delayed due to proprietary technology uncertainties and a foundational authorization controversy. The terminology was cautious, but the suggestion was transparent. The marketplace, which prospers on certainty, acknowledged instantly. The organization's equity, consistent for months, experienced its initial observable descent, declining 9% in a solitary morning. The tremor had become an undeniable catastrophe. This exterior force compelled the Chief Operating Officer Eleanor out of the concealment. She initiated an emergency comprehensive personnel session, a documentation of which was transmitted to me by a previous associate. I observed as Eleanor, her tone constricted with compelled assurance, attributed the disruption on antiquated historical agreements and the unreasonable requirements of a dissatisfied previous employee. Then Connor, the head of human resources, acquired the communication device to guarantee the personnel. I desire to be flawlessly transparent, he stated, his tone resonating with artificial authority. Our exceptional legal collective has comprehensively examined this frivolous assertion and has established it possesses absolutely zero merit. This is a temporary complication and we possess the circumstance under management. He was communicating strength, but I understood it was a performance created of desperation. Just as I completed observing the documentation, my communication device signaled. It was Andrew. His inflection was no longer calm. It was penetrating and genuine, the tone he utilized when a new battleground in a conflict had accessed. Paisley, I just received a notification from our legal courier, he stated. They attempted to deliver documentation at your residence. What variety of documentation? I inquired, my personal tone remaining stable. They're not simply characterizing your assertion frivolous in organizational sessions anymore, he stated. They've executed their official maneuver. They have submitted a legal action against you. They are prosecuting you for organizational intimidation. Intimidation? It was an aggressive, assertive, and ridiculous maneuver. It was also the maneuver that would provide my attorney the legal jurisdiction to require entry to everything they had been attempting to hide. They hadn't simply prosecuted me. They had presented us the mechanisms to their domain. My initial acknowledgement to being prosecuted was not apprehension, but a frigid, calculating composure. I informed Andrew what I was considering. They just provided you the mechanisms, he verified, his tone penetrating with concentration. This legal action is a monumental error. Their endeavor to frighten you now legally compels them to engage in the revelation procedure. They have to surrender electronic communications, documentation and internal communications related to your dismissal and the authorization. They assume they've confined you, but they've actually extended an invitation into their establishment to examine for documentation. The organization, in its arrogance, executed the legal action public. They distributed an announcement declaring they were executing legal measures against a dissatisfied previous employee participating in intimidation methods. It was a forceful maneuver constructed to isolate me and characterize me as a materialistic antagonist. But it possessed the contrary impact. For others who had been expelled or quieted by the revised management, it was a declaration of conflict, and it inadvertently summoned them to my position. My communication device initiated to signal. The initial communications were from previous engineers, exceptional intellects who had been component of my collective for years before being dismissed in Connor's reorganization. Paisley, we observed the information. One of them stated, his tone constricted with fury. It's a fabrication. We comprehend the reality. We were in the initiative sessions last year when the legal collective identified the founder's authorization as a potential risk. We possess the electronic communication sequences. Within hours, my attorney had a protected anonymous channel established and the documentation initiated to arrive. Validation that their carelessness wasn't a negligence, but a calculated risk. Then a more substantial communication arrived. It was from Mason, the initial chief operating officer who had initiated the organization with me and withdrew a year following the acquisition. He had been observing from the periphery, horrified at what was occurring to the organization they had constructed collectively. I examined their announcement. Paisley, he stated, his tone substantial with disappointment. They're attempting to reconstruct our chronology. That provision was positioned there to safeguard the essence of the organization, the originators. I am more than prepared to supply a sworn declaration to that impact. I'll provide testimony in judicial proceedings if it arrives to that. His assistance wasn't simply comforting. It was a substantial validation of my complete assertion. The concluding communication of the day arrived from a contact I didn't identify. The individual on the alternative portion introduced himself as an executive journalist from a substantial financial publication. He stated he had been pursuing the narrative, the suspended Japanese arrangement, the equity dissent, and now the peculiarly aggressive legal action. The organization's official account, he stated, just didn't possess coherence. He desired to comprehend the alternative perspective of the narrative. Off the documentation. I paused, observing out my aperture at the descending solar body. The confrontation had until now been executed through attorneys and legal notifications. This was an extension to execute in a new environment, the tribunal of public perception. I consented to encounter him. It was duration for the marketplace to comprehend the distinction between a designation on a compensation roster and a designation on a patent. My encounter with the journalist resulted in a fastidiously investigated publication that established the chronology of occurrences in harsh specification. It was equilibrated, formal, and for the organization it was devastating. The narrative was no longer about a dissatisfied employee. It was about a founding collaborator, a fundamental proprietary technology controversy, and reckless management. The equity, already wounded, descended another 18%. The subdued tremor had become a comprehensive catastrophe, and the substantial investors were requiring responses. The notification did not arrive from a tribunal, but from the administrator of the administration itself. It was an official demand for me and my legal representative to participate in an emergency administration session. The authority dynamic had transformed. They were no longer prosecuting me into quietness. They were compelled to observe. We encountered in the principal administrative space, a location constructed for frightening with its extended mahogany surface and a partition of glass overlooking the metropolis. I occupied with Andrew on one position of that surface. Across from us occupied the chief operating officer, Eleanor, appearing pale and exhausted, her usual organizational confidence vanished. Beside her, Connor, the head of human resources, manipulated documents, declining to create visual contact. The 9 members of the administration were positioned around them, their features grim, uninterpretable coverings of worry. The atmosphere was substantial with a tension you could almost experience. The administrator initiated, his tone low and grave, articulating the objective of the session was to comprehend the fundamental cause of the current catastrophe. He then oriented to me. Miss Mercer, we are here to observe. I didn't articulate. I simply provided a modest, intentional acknowledgement to Andrew. He elevated, his movements calm and systematic, his tone even and controlled. He established the sequence of occurrences. He displayed the chronology of my dismissal, the verified correspondences, the sworn declaration about the destroyed correspondence, the electronic message from the Japanese collaborators, and the declination notification from the Patent Administration. He displayed the documentation our anonymous allies had supplied. He wasn't disputing or accusing. He was simply establishing a fortress of realities, component by undeniable component. When he completed, a substantial quietness descended over the space. The administration members observed from the documentation Andrew had distributed to the palette-featured operating officer. Ultimately, the most substantial investor on the administration. A formidable woman who had constructed her standing on astute, unsentimental determinations articulated for the initial occasion. Her stare was positioned exclusively on Eleanor. "Miss Eleanor," she stated, her tone subdued, but penetrating through the quietness like fractured material. "I possess a straightforward affirmative or negative inquiry for you. Did you or did you not possess comprehension that Miss Mercer's designation was on the foundational authorization when you and Mr. Hayes authorized her dismissal?" The quietness that pursued was more substantial than any financial analysis. It was the resonance of a monarch being defeated by a phantom. Eleanor didn't respond the inquiry, not with terminology, but her quietness was an admission. A dark flush advanced up her anatomy, and her visual organs shifted around the space, searching for an escape she could not locate. She accessed her oral cavity, but only a parched, mechanical resonance emerged. The formidable investor who had inquired the inquiry simply stared back at her, her demeanor transforming from inquiry to frozen contempt. In that instance, every individual on that administration understood the reality. They had been directed into a catastrophe by a chief operating officer who was either substantially negligent or had intentionally hidden a catastrophic risk. The session did not terminate. It fragmented. The administrator abruptly declared it concluded. The investors propelled their seating back and established a constricted, anxious assembly in the section of the space, pointedly rotating their anatomies on Eleanor and Connor. Andrew and I collected our documents without a statement. There was nothing more to articulate. We had displayed the realities and the realities had executed their function. As we walked out of that boardroom, I knew it was over. They'd had 30 days to fix their mistake, and done nothing. The next morning I sat in my home office as the sun rose on day 30. No last-minute calls. No desperate offers. Just silence. At 8:30 a.m. I called Andrew. "Advance." By 9 o'clock his announcement went out to every major financial outlet. The company's license to use its core technology was revoked, permanently. Any further use would be willful IP infringement. 15 minutes later my phone rang. "Eleanor. Paisley, please, just tell us what you want." Her voice was a whisper stripped of every ounce of arrogance. "It's too late for that," I said and hung up. The fallout was immediate. Production halted. Shipments froze. Trading was suspended. By noon both Eleanor and Connor were fired. A week later the board came back with a blank check. I turned it down. Money wasn't the point. That I laid out my terms. A rebuilt company rooted in our original mission. I wouldn't be an employee, I'd be a founding board member with permanent oversight. They agreed to everything. Months later I walked back into the rebranded headquarters. The hum of the data center no longer sounded like a countdown. It sounded like possibility. My office wasn't a showpiece, it was a command center. And the leadership? Real technologists who understood that innovation dies without its creators. Connor vanished into obscurity. Eleanor's name became shorthand for catastrophic leadership failure. I didn't dwell on them. My focus was building something better, with stronger safeguards. No founder could be fired without unanimous board approval. No core division could be dismantled without proving continued innovation capacity. The company's purpose was now a legally binding covenant, signed annually by every executive. At our first quarterly meeting, people weren't chasing quarterly profits. They were debating how to balance responsibility with bold invention. It felt like the early days again. 6 months in, a young engineer named Sophie reached out. She'd just been laid off for being too idealistic. Over coffee she asked, "Do you regret any of it? The fight, the fallout, losing what you built?"